my practice is actually, it's really quite varied. I would say I tend to use the medium as like a means to achieve an end. So I've worked in printmaking, I work in installation, I work in sculpture, I work in painting, paper cutting, really just a variety of anything. And I sort of tend to cycle and shift through these different mediums according to how I'm feeling to working at the time. So really, I work through a wide variety of mediums in my practice. I would say I'm a very instinctual worker. Like it feels like sometimes people expect there to be like an equation for how artists work. And I found, oh man, everyone just has such a different way of working. And I found that, I've definitely had to develop my own way of working. So I like to be very instinctive about it. And a lot of the time I'll read something or I'll see something on TV or really just any kind of thing. And I'll think, wow, that really kind of applies to what I'm doing, and kind of let myself kind of like float through it and really think about it. And and again, in thinking about how you think there's a way you're supposed to work or go, I used to think that I needed to do a lot of sketchbook work and this and that. I actually don't work in a sketchbook at all very often. I'll keep notes or I'll think about something, but I don't use it to work through them necessarily. So I prefer to do that like on paper and like with the project itself, which is, again, stepping away from being afraid of making mistakes, which I'm sure everyone has done this, where you hit a point in a piece or a project and you're like, this has been a huge mistake. And I find that like usually I can push myself past that, and I found it's been a really good exercise in having more confidence in what I do and also trusting myself in the process a little bit more. Yeah, no, I did actually want to be an artist my whole life. And so my grandma Richter, my dad's grandma, she really loved to paint, and she actually wanted to be an art teacher, but then World War II happened and that ended up not panning out, of course. And so I grew up seeing all of these paintings that she'd done of flowers and landscapes, and she'd actually on the walls of the family farmhouse, she painted these big, massive murals of kind of the landscapes she remembered from living in Germany. And so I remember seeing those and thinking, that's what I want to do. And so, as far back as I can remember, I remember the first time I got to paint, and that was my grandma letting me do that. And I also remember my mom worked at the town credit union, and she would bring back I don't know if anyone else will remember these. I'm sure people around my age will. It was kind of like the dot matrix paper with the little things on the side, and there was green lines on one side and white on the other. My mom would bring me just all of that paper home for me to draw on, and so I just always loved drawing, and I kind of just never considered any other career. I went to University of Regina to do a Bachelor of Fine Arts, ended up doing printmaking there, and then I later went back to do a Master of Fine Arts. And I feel like the Bachelor of Fine Arts was for me at least, and I think, I'm always very envious of people who figure things out a little bit more quickly. I'm a slow learner, and I take a little bit more time to figure things out. So it wasn't until the end of my BFA that I kind of figured out that I was really interested in exploring family and identity. And then when I did my MFA, then I got to really dive into those ideas and really focus on mastering what I thought about those. And so I'm really glad I did both. And then I also had an opportunity to do the CARFAC mentorship program, which is really fantastic. And anyone who can do it, I think you should do it. And I got to work with Heather Benning and do a large-scale installation project in an abandoned house that also further explored family identity. So it's just interesting to me that my art journey started with my grandma Richter and wanting to do what she wanted to do. And then, to this day, I'm still making work about my family and identity and what that is. And I think that's kind of a beautiful chain connecting everything. my grandmother was a refugee from the war, and she did one painting of her wartime experiences, and it was like this very horrifying, bloody painting that hung over the television in their living room. And so like this depiction of her wartime experiences hung over every family dinner, everything like that, and was kind of, for me, very much this first introduction into this idea that like, art isn't just for being pretty or being beautiful. It can explore really deep graphic things. And so, I actually have that painting now in my house. And for me, that was like, again, this like very common thread that I was so influenced by this painting, and I'm still making all this work about it to this day. I mentioned briefly that my work is really influenced by my family history. And really it draws a lot on German-Canadian identity in post-World War II Canada, and some of the conflicted feelings I have about that, and sort of, what it is to grow up with trauma in your family that isn't necessarily acceptable or acknowledged, because, of course, many Canadians were very traumatized by the Second World War, and of course, my family is coming over here, and they're the ones that we're the enemy. And how do you cope with that? How do you talk about that in a meaningful way? And so, I really am interested in exploring trauma, intergenerational trauma, how we can talk about it, but also the way we interpret identity. So I talk a lot about folklore, both British and German. I'm British on my mom's side, and of course, my mom's mom, my grandma Stockdale, also loved art, and so she's another reason why I love art as well too. So it's kind of fun to get it from both sides. But I'm really interested in how we can use folklore and folk identity and folk tales as a way to kind of heal and explore trauma. And it's become this really fascinating way for me to kind of step back from family history and contextualize it in a larger worldview that I think is really accessible to everyone. I think, in Canada, we're really undergoing a bit of a crisis of identity as we kind of, think about colonialism, identity. How do we figure all of that out? And so I think folklore and folk ritual and tradition are ways to talk about that, that really connect us to each other. So I think, I think that's kind of my work very much in a nutshell, I think. Right now what I'm trying to do for my practice is exhibit outside of the province a little bit more. Like, I have a pretty good exhibition record within the province, and that's awesome. So I'd like to get a little bit more outside, and it's always funny how these things happen. This year I set myself a goal of applying to more things, and now I have 2 exhibitions outside the province scheduled for next year, and I'm like, okay, so I'm kind of meeting my goal there already, which is kind of, which is nice. But, I find setting yearly goals really helps for me. And so now that I've kind of gotten, all right, okay, so those 2 goals are done. My other goal is to really just dive in a little bit more into research. I think like most artists, like yourself, I'm a practicing artist, but I also work at an arts organization. And so of course, I'm working almost full time, trying to balance an art practice and a very demanding cat. She's beautiful. And so what I'd really like to do this year is just kind of take a step back this year and just focus on research, development of my practice, and just get it to where I want it to be, bring my technical painting skills up to things. It's always interesting because when I did the house project, I could kind of skate through a little bit because it was such a large project that I could get away with some of my technical stuff not being quite perfect. But then you sit down with drawing or painting and you're like, oh no, you can tell everything I've done wrong here. And so I'd really like to just take a step back, focus on my technique, focus on my research, focus on my practice, and just kind of develop it to this point that I'd like it to be at. It's one of the only pieces of work that I've made about the pandemic and kind of my anxieties around it, as you can see by my lovely mask. Clearly there's a pandemic. So I got married this year too, and of course everything ended up being different. I was supposed to elope to Scotland and very obviously could not do that. And so when I was starting this piece, I listened to this podcast called The Heart is a Cauldron, and I was listening to an episode that was all about transitions and how fall and autumn is a transitional period, right? Like there's geese flying south. It's such a weird time of year because we're suspended in the middle of everything. And in Saskatchewan, it's so brief. Like you blink and fall is gone all the time. And it's just this beautiful precarious thing, and you're just existing in this liminal space. And so when I was working on this piece, I was thinking all about the way, we're in this really liminal time right now during a pandemic. We're all suspended, everything is weird, everything is upside down, and we're all just trying to get through it. And then as I was working on it, bringing in these elements of harvest, these geese flying south, kind of that autumn light, the figure I was working with became a bride, and I was like, well, that's not a coincidence, obviously. And it's weird thinking of how I didn't plan it, and it just kind of did happen because obviously I was dealing with, I was anxious. I was scared about how different everything is. I was scared that my family was coming in. I'm scared because if I catch COVID-19, I could die because I have a bad history of respiratory illness. And, all of these transitions and things we're going through, the pandemic is a temporary state, but it doesn't feel like that at all. Even as we're standing here talking about it, we started the day chatting about the pandemic and talking about the logistics of masks. And, as I stand here, I'm adjusting this mask, but it's not forever. And I find that's really hard to remember sometimes. So when I worked on this piece, it was really, really therapeutic, and is probably going to be the only piece I do about it. But but for me, it's just hopeful in that it is transition, and we'll blink and it'll be done, and we'll be like, oh, that's it. So yeah, I don't know. It's a bit of a depressing piece, but it's also hopeful for me. So.